May 326 BCE, northern India, a river called Hydaspes, today we call it Jhelum, it sits in modern-day Pakistan. And on this night, this one river is doing something that no Persian king, no Greek city, no desert, no mountain had ever managed to do in 10 years of continuous warfare. It is stopping Alexander the Great completely cold. He is standing on the western bank staring across churning floodwater at something his army has never faced before and has absolutely no answer for. 200 war elephants. Standing in a line on the far bank like a living wall of muscle and ivory and pure biological terror. Behind them 50,000 Indian soldiers under a king named Porus. A king who received Alexander's demand for submission and sent back a message so simple and so devastating that Alexander's own generals went quiet when they heard it. Porus said he would meet Alexander on the battlefield. And he would be waiting. Alexander was 29 years old. He had been at war since he was 16. He had destroyed the Persian Empire, the largest empire the world had ever seen. He had crossed deserts that his own men said were impossible to survive. He had taken cities that military experts called impregnable. He had fought battles where he was outnumbered 2 to 1, 3 to 1, sometimes more, and had won every single one. His soldiers believed he was the son of a god. Some days Alexander believed it himself. And now he was standing at a flooded river in the middle of a monsoon season staring at war elephants and feeling something that almost no moment in 10 years of warfare had ever made him feel. Uncertain. Here is what made the elephants so terrifying and why this moment was so different from anything Alexander had faced before. Horses are prey animals. They are hardwired by millions of years of evolution to fear large predators. And a war elephant to a horse is the most overwhelming predatory signal that exists in nature. The smell alone is enough. Horses that had charge. The night of the crossing was not what Alexander's soldiers expected. They had crossed rivers before, the Granicus, the Issus, the Tigris, but those crossings had happened in conditions that were difficult but manageable. This night was different. The monsoon that had been filling the Hydaspes for weeks had not stopped. Rain was falling in sheets so heavy that soldiers standing 2 meters apart could barely see each other. The river was running faster and deeper than any crossing point Alexander's engineers had identified during their weeks of preparation. And the boats that had been quietly assembled upstream, hidden in forest cover, and brought to the crossing point in pieces were now being launched into water that was actively trying to destroy them. Alexander had chosen a crossing point approximately 27 kilometers upstream from his main camp. Far enough that Porus's scouts watching the main camp would not immediately see the movement. Close enough that once across his force could reach the main Indian army before Porus had time to fully reposition. He took with him approximately 11,000 men. Not his entire army. His second-in-command Craterus remained at the main camp with the bulk of the force under strict orders. Do not cross until you see the elephants engaged. Do not cross until Porus has committed his forces against me. And if Porus leaves only a small force watching you, then cross immediately and hit them from behind. It was a plan that required perfect timing, perfect communication, and perfect execution across a flooded river in a monsoon at night with no modern communication technology of any kind. If anything went wrong, there was no way to send a message fast enough to stop the consequences. The crossing itself nearly ended the battle before it began. Halfway across the river, Alexander's lead boats discovered that what they had identified as the far bank from a distance was not the far bank at all. It was a large island in the middle of. Alexander looked at that elephant line and made a decision in minutes that military historians still argue about today. He would not charge the elephants directly. He would not send his infantry into that wall of living terror and watch his phalanx collapse in panic and trampling. Instead, he would do something that required a level of battlefield coordination that no ancient army except his had ever been capable of executing under pressure. He would attack the flanks. Strip away the Indian cavalry protecting the sides of the elephant line. Surround the entire Indian formation. And then drive the elephants back into their own infantry using a combination of noise javelins and the one thing elephants cannot psychologically handle for extended periods. Pressure from every direction simultaneously with no escape route. The plan sounds clean stated that way. In execution, it was chaos wrapped in genius. Alexander personally led his companion cavalry against the Indian cavalry on Porus's left flank, moving at a speed that the Indian horsemen were not prepared for. He had learned from every previous battle that speed was the great equalizer, that an army responding to events always loses to an army creating events. He hit the Indian left flank cavalry before they had finished repositioning from the earlier engagement where his son had died. The Indian cavalry was good, well-trained, well-equipped, and fighting for their homeland under a king they genuinely respected. But they were fighting a man who had been doing this since he was 16 against armies 3 times this size, and they were fighting him on a day when everything had gone wrong for them since before dawn. While Alexander hit the left flank, he sent his general Caenus with a significant cavalry force around the back of the Indian position to hit the right flank from behind. This was the move that required the most trust and the most coordination. Caenus had to ride around the entire Indian army without being seen. Porus was brought before Alexander in the late afternoon. The battle was over. The Indian army had been destroyed or scattered. The ground between the two armies was covered with the dead of both sides and the enormous bodies of elephants that had changed the shape of the fighting in ways nobody had fully processed yet. Alexander was sitting on his horse Bucephalus, the same horse he had ridden since he was a boy of 12 when he had broken the animal that every adult in his father's court had declared unrideable. Bucephalus was old now. He had been old for several years. He had carried Alexander through Persia, through Egypt, through Afghanistan, through the Hindu Kush mountains, through every battle of the last 10 years, and he was still carrying him now on this afternoon in northern India covered in the mud and blood of the Hydaspes. Alexander looked at the man being brought toward him, and what he saw made him sit up straighter on his horse. Porus was wounded. Multiple javelin wounds across his body. His elephant had been wounded too and had knelt to allow its king to dismount when it became clear the battle was finished, which is itself a detail worth pausing on because a wounded elephant choosing to kneel for its wounded king rather than flee is not behavior that happens between an animal and a man who has not spent years building something that goes beyond the conventional relationship between a weapon and its user. Porus walked toward Alexander with wounds that should have made walking difficult, and he walked the way a king walks, not performing dignity, actually possessing it. He was enormous. He made every man around him look smaller simply by existing near them. And he had just lost everything. His army, his son, the battle he had chosen to fight rather than submit. And he was walking toward the man who had taken all of it from him without any visible sign that losing had changed what he fundamentally was. Alexander asked him through interpreters how he wished. The days after Hydaspes should have felt like triumph. Alexander had done what nobody believed was possible. He had crossed a flooded river at night in a monsoon. He had defeated war elephants with cavalry that was terrified of them. He had destroyed an army twice his size on ground chosen by the enemy specifically to maximize Indian advantages. He had won a battle that military experts studying it 2,000 years later still consider one of the most tactically brilliant engagements in ancient history. His soldiers had fought magnificently. His plan had worked at every stage. Porus had been defeated and turned into an ally. The path east was open, and Alexander wanted to keep walking. Beyond the Hydaspes lay the Hyphasis River, modern-day Beas in Punjab. And beyond that river, according to every piece of intelligence Alexander had gathered, lay the Nanda Empire, the largest and most powerful empire on the Indian subcontinent. Ancient sources describe the Nanda army as containing 200,000 infantry, 20,000 cavalry, 3,000 war elephants, and thousands of war chariots. Whether those numbers are exactly accurate or somewhat exaggerated by the sources does not change the fundamental reality they describe. What lay beyond the Hyphasis was bigger than anything Alexander had yet faced. More elephants than Porus had. More soldiers. More resources. An empire that had been building its military power for generations, specifically in the territory it was defending. Alexander wanted to cross the Hyphasis and find out. His generals did not. And this disagreement, which had been building quietly under the surface of the campaign for months, finally broke open in the weeks after Hydaspes in a way that could not be managed or postponed or redirected. Alexander called an assembly of his senior commanders and laid out his vision. They were close. They had come so far. The Eastern Ocean, the edge of the world as Greek geography understood it, was just beyond the The army turned west. After years of moving east with purpose and momentum and the psychological engine of continuous forward progress, the reversal of direction did something to the collective mind of Alexander's force that no single battle had managed to do. Going east had always felt like going toward something. Going west felt like going away from something. And the men who had wept with relief at the decision to turn back discovered within days of actually turning back that relief and happiness are not the same thing. They had wanted to stop advancing. They had not fully understood that stopping advancing meant confronting everything they had been moving too fast to feel for 10 years. The faces of the people they had left behind. The years they had lost. The men who had died beside them and been buried in Persian soil and Afghan soil and Indian soil so far from Macedonia that their families would never find the graves. Moving fast had kept all of that at a manageable distance. Turning around brought it close. Alexander chose to return by a route that his senior commanders considered unnecessarily dangerous and that history has judged as one of the most catastrophic decisions of his entire campaign. He split his force into 3 parts. One under Craterus would take the easier northern route through territory already pacified and under Macedonian control. One would travel by sea under Alexander's Admiral Nearchus, following the coastline from India back toward Persia, a naval expedition that had never been attempted before, and that would produce its own extraordinary story of survival. And Alexander himself would lead the 3rd force through the Gadrosian Desert, modern-day Balochistan in southern Pakistan and southeastern Iran. A vast waterless waste that multiple ancient sources indicate Alexander had been specifically warned was impassable for a large army. That previous attempts to march armies through it had ended in disaster. That the Persian king Cyrus the Babylon 323 BCE. Alexander the Great is 32 years old. He has conquered more of the known world than any human being before him and more than almost any human being who would come after him for centuries. He controls territory stretching from Greece to northwestern India, from Egypt to the steppes of Central Asia. An empire so large that no single person had ever governed anything close to its size before, and that no single person would successfully hold together after him, as events were about to prove. He has returned from India. He has survived the Gadrosian Desert. He is planning his next campaign. Because Alexander without a campaign to plan is not really Alexander, and the men around him understood that the restlessness that had driven him across the known world for 12 years did not stop simply because he had run out of east to conquer. He is now looking west, at Arabia, Carthage, at the western Mediterranean. The world that Alexander had not yet touched was still large enough to occupy the next decade of his life, and he intended to occupy it. In June 323 BC, Alexander attended a dinner hosted by his Macedonian general Medius of Larissa. This dinner is the last documented event of Alexander's life before his final illness began. Ancient sources agree on this much. What they do not agree on is almost everything that follows. Alexander drank heavily at the dinner. This was not unusual. Alexander drank heavily at many dinners and had done so throughout his adult life. Alcohol was a consistent presence in his life in a way that some ancient sources treat as evidence of weakness and others treat as simply consistent with the culture of the Macedonian court, where heavy drinking was not considered a vice but a normal part of male social bonding at the highest levels of society. He drank at the dinner of Medius, and then he drank more, and then at some point in the night he began to feel unwell. What followed over the next 11 days is documented in some. There is a question that sits underneath everything we have covered in this video. Underneath the river crossing and the elephants and the brilliant tactics and the death of Bucephalus and the army that finally said no in the desert that killed more people than any battle and the death of a 32-year-old in Babylon whose empire dissolved within a generation of his last breath. The question is simple and it has no clean answer, and that is exactly why it matters. Did Alexander the Great actually win? Not the battles, not the campaigns, not the individual moments of tactical brilliance that military academies still study today. Did he win the thing he was actually trying to win? Whatever that thing was, he never lost a battle. This is historically documented and genuinely extraordinary. In 12 years of continuous warfare against enemies ranging from Greek city-states to the Persian Empire to Afghan tribal confederations to Indian kingdoms with war elephants, Alexander's army was never defeated in a pitched engagement. Never. Not once. The record is perfect in a way that military history almost never produces, because military history is full of great commanders who had one bad day or one miscalculation or one enemy who found the weakness in their system. Alexander's system had no weakness that any enemy ever successfully exploited in open battle. Hydaspes was his most difficult tactical challenge, and he solved it with a level of creativity and coordination that makes military historians reach for superlatives they would not use for almost any other commander in history. But he never reached the Eastern Ocean. He turned back at the Hydaspes River because his army refused to cross it. And that refusal is not a footnote in the story of Alexander. It is the hinge on which the entire meaning of the story turns. Because Alexander's stated purpose was not to defeat Persia specifically or to conquer India specifically or to reach any particular river.